Hello everyone, today we talk about Indian tactics in the Hellenistic era, roughly 4th to 2nd century BC. We already discussed ancient Indian warfare, chiefly during this era that is dominated by the Mauryans and this imperial dynasty lording over a great part of the Indian subcontinent, especially the Indo-Gangetic plain as a whole. There would be much to say. Probably we will digress on this from a political and a statal point of view, because when we look at tactics, we're essentially looking at also what kind of armies are capable of performing them. That's basically the point. Collective training, who can provide with the level of coercion and properly training, so all the supplies, all the resources invested for that, in order to field these forces. This video is not about the army's organization. And I remember actually what we made about the, let's say, this Hellenistic era Indian warfare already, because we detailed, to an important extent, the type of combat of the year. I have 17 videos. This is the 18th on Indian warfare from all eras, and especially this Mauryan era content was from the very early days of Schwerpunkt. So we've made actually Mauryan Indian Army Organization. It was one of the few videos I have still re-upload with unblurred images. We also talk about the ancient Indian war elephant, which is also, as you know, employed not just in India. As a matter of fact, I thought I had. Oh yes, also Mauryan Indian infantry. And by the way, I'm coming up with yet another video about Mauryan, this, in any case, this part of ancient Indian heavy, armored infantry specifically. So we already entered a little bit the whole picture. We talked about the Indo-Scythians. We have, however, to complete a bit more thoroughly, and we're far from that. This era of Indian warfare. I don't know whether it's because of the Pajit memes or something that doesn't make people watch this Indian warfare content that much. I don't know how or why. I'm trying to, in fact, at some point I'm forced, given that YouTube has been having lots of issues worldwide. I mean, it's just a platform that's basically being blocked the received views, right, how they track them because of ads, AD blocks, right, and this penalizes a little bit the content of all creators of here we have lost a bit less than 1/4 of views, etc., but apparently they're working to fix it in a way or another. Not good, because I'm doing great content trying to counterbalance the issue, but when it comes to these videos, I know that people are not going to watch it as much. I try, in fact, to intersperse them, to surround them, to enshrine them with much more clicked videos. In fact, I think the other day, the video about the Sarmato-Germanic campaigns of Constantine, all the weekend trail, this is the good moment to make Indian warfare most, because I talk India mostly from a military point of view. I think only one video was about sort of, I think, medieval India in general. But we cover really many different eras of Indian warfare. Notice that people don't watch it for some reason. But it's interesting. It's interesting because India presents naturally with this great challenge, right, of an enormous complex system. It wasn't even that radically heterogeneous within itself, and also with other civilizations. Europe and China were actually more advanced than India. Right, it's not just about quantity, as we will learn perhaps better also in the video about the Indian armored infantrymen. You can have vast demic and agricultural basins, but not having, just in relation to one another, a very advantageous surplus. Naturally, in India, there is a great deal of statal development, especially at this point under the Mauryas. However, let's say that there is some level of privatization, oligarchization, and feudalization as well in the outer world of this major landed assets of the Kshatriya, all right, the the traditional warrior caste, whereas states were making more leverage as with their monarchs on the third estates of the major cities. Essentially, Buddhism, as you know, as a complaint of the former, say, decadence of the Vedic teachings. We talked a lot about this in the Europeistics. It's a bit something like, I don't know, Christian criticism to the ways, at least, the older traditional Catholic religion had been literally performed, had really, where it had failed its mission at the end of the day. And so we will talk, if anything, more about this. But the period we're talking about is interesting for a number of reasons. Being slightly more backward, civilization speaking, than the other major Eurasian civilizations, India, it's big, but it also presents some sort of primitive, archaic elements. It was actually very developed and advanced in some ways. I personally studied in Indian warfare, realized that especially cavalry warfare, at this point chariots were still there, interestingly enough, was pretty advanced. But we're talking properly horsemanship. We've seen it also in the video about medieval Indian warfare. Consider that here we're not, the continuous use of war chariot in Indian warfare is pretty organic and systemic. This is not just, I don't know, like in at this time actually in the West we have still the Seleucids that on the Mesopotamian plains and elsewhere as well that use this very heavy chariots that became ever bulkier to be just thrown at the enemy and not performing hit and run and eventually just smashing tactics like in the Bronze Age. The only other people, say Northern Europe, the Celts, in North Africa, the Garamantes used to fight still with smaller chariots, however. In India, there is an incredibly and traumatically elite military culture that is able, through this massive latifundio, to really invest so much still in something like, not just chariot, but elephant warfare, for example. And we already tried to profile exactly through different arms, and we've seen it through the army organization, what properly Indian armies were about at this point in history. As something particularly impressive that probably, because of the scarce both historiographical and archaeological documentation, is also partially obscured. All right, India has an incredibly sort of stylized form of literature and also artistic expression for which we often don't understand too much what is going on. It's also general scarcity, iconographically. Think about the Sanchi stupas, for example. Those are one of the very few, say, very graphically explicit images of what Indian warriors would have actually looked like in a historically military accurate sense. So it's complicated to try to reconstruct the system, but on the basis of what we've already said, we will describe here better, trying to read a bit through the lines of those texts that from the Vedic tradition focus mostly on the hero, almost on a champion-based dualistic culture. As you know, this type of heroic warfare never fully existed in literal sort of one-to-one, and there were always retinues, there was always a level of tactical specialization. So this is what we're going to look at, also because we know that Indian armies were pretty big for different reasons. Because when it gets down to the sources, this is the main issue. Again, massively developed military system, activity, at the same time, very sort of limited documentary evidence. This actually, in and of itself, is not merely a paradox. It is true that Indian civilizations, as we just explained, is not as productive and as specific, let's say qualitatively advanced as other, especially statal empires like Rome, like China. They are much more unitarily advanced way of retaining control. India is huge, hyperpopulated, but in this sense also very, let's say, earthly generous, so to say, a veritably hellish reality at a higher level in a political sense. Indian warfare was a formalized and ritualistic endeavor if we are to listen to the few sources that we're provided with, that obviously are by themselves telling us something particularly sound about the mentality of the era and why it's offering interesting social cultural insight, what warfare would have actually been like. So this type of warfare was theoretically guided by a chivalrous code of conduct, very much informed by the Vedic, the Indo-European mentality, and seldom focused on the total destruction of the adversary, at least by some sort, in fact, of knightly ethos, right? As we'll see now, things were sort of different. The ideal is different. We should not underestimate the feudal knightly dimension, again, of Indian military culture, but we should also realize that if we look at Rome or China, we tended to sort of conceptualize the idea that these other two systems, it's not like for India, this is even overly, let's say, emphasized by historiography, because if anything, the fault is the historiographies, especially of the last generation, at least, from the 1960s, the 1970s, the idea that these were all socio-economical, impersonal socio-economical systems that you have to understand in some kind of materialistic, deterministic sense. All these cultures were traumatically as violently informed by a radical knightly ideology. And the Roman Empire itself was essentially a massive feudal system. You can see it in different ways, regardless of the degree of power concentration, right? In India, it was such a big system, there were many people lording over others, but in relative to the latter, there were very few, all right? There was an almost sclerotic oligarchy, an ultra-elite, and the vast majority of the entire population was merely subjected to a status that, as you know, according to the traditional doctrine of the castes, were not properly even considered as humans, right? There was basically the Vedic, the Indo-European race, ideally like living in the higher cases, and then the subjects were basically non-existent, were being continuously sort of birthed and reswallowed by the Mother Earth and used as also for very menial purposes. It's not like they didn't participate to the army to an extent, but still with an establishment mentality that was very rigid, and this was the dominating one, right? Buddhism, as we were saying before, was essentially supported by the great centralizing emperors such as, Chandragupta Maurya. Obviously, this had nothing to do with some sort of kind of liberation of pacifism. Chandragupta was at least propagandizing these ideas, but were knocking out people very, very widely, and also for very specific religious persecution. The Kshatriya caste was exactly the more autonomous, more feudal, the one who wanted to be left alone in the countryside, and that at the end of the day, always say this system always, in Indian history, there's always a new regime and that rises and then gets swallowed once again. So obviously, compared to Rome, that had the highest per capita wealth in the world, so the most even and highest wealth distribution in the world, where the Romans considered themselves as well, in the European terms, the master race chosen by God to lord over other peoples in this great feudal hierarchy, within themselves had a way more egalitarian concept. And you know that Roman society was also oligarchic, never as much as India. These continental European peoples were much more sort of final rank, strong. We've seen them also with the sea peoples clashing against pretty sort of hierarchically stratified systems like the Egyptian ones, etc. So it's true that India has a more specifically chivalric and sort of feudal mentality that resembles very much, in fact, the ones of eventually the European Middle Ages as well. Also, of course, like even though, again, the most important arms in India were the mounted ones, right? So chariotry, cavalry, elephantry. Still, there was an enormous amount of infantrymen. This wouldn't change too much also in the Middle Ages, but let's say the broader Indian system here will represent this greater collapse of the lower people compared to other peoples that instead had been rising more recently in this more evenly spread fashion. And the Arthashastra, as you know, an ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, military strategy, and even economics attributed to Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, 4th century BC advisor to the same Mauryan emperor Chandragupta that we just mentioned, delineates, ideally in this almost sort of political treatise, that is, however, religiously inspired, and so, of course, always aiming at reconstructing divine perfection on earth and or properly segmenting the different levels of sort of divinity and fall. Delineates 3 types of conquest. There is a righteous conquest, aiming to secure tribute and allegiance from a weaker neighboring state, which is a form of protection of the same. It's a redeeming effort almost, and we've seen it really very often in our videos about Indo-European theology. The conqueror, this is the same idea of any empire, traditionally speaking, elevates the conquered, at least if the empire is actually successful, just like the Romans basically conferred dignity to the subjected peoples that can, if properly serving Rome and demonstrating military religious terms to be worth it, can become Roman themselves as the chosen people of God in this universal empire, right? So in this righteous conquest, according to the Arthashastra, the defeated ruler is allowed to retain their throne as a vassal ally, and so it's basically, ideally, this shouldn't even have war. It's a bit like the Alexandrian model. Alexander was so great that so many people simply opened the gates to him because they conferred to him the imperium that he deserved. And in this righteous form of war, the victor is merciful because he has convinced the subject to become his vassal. And he aspires to be acknowledged as, in fact, a Chakravartin, a Sanskrit term meaning universal ruler or world emperor, symbolizing supreme sovereignty in Indian political thought, and obviously meaning that the entire world is bowing to this rightful ruler by just divine mercy. Remember that always in traditional theology, Indo-European or not, there is only one source of power, that is God, right? So whoever has power, regardless of how they end, whether they make it into divinity or they fall as titans, that's actually the only divide between a God and a fallen, right? Between God himself and whoever failed to be God, there is always, like in every form of power, in every degree of power, that same degree of righteousness for some reason, all right? Which is very much against the prevailing, even if people don't know to be Gnostic, most people, including the faithful religion, they reason mostly as radicalized Gnostics, and they don't even understand what that actually means. Now, this readiness to accept the overlordship of a dominant conqueror accounts for why numerous Indian states willingly submitted to Alexander, for example, that truly would leave on a legacy of universal rule that would live on also in Asia during Islam, reaching as far as Southeast Asia. And of course, the Magus was such, because the Indians had heard what had happened in the West, what the Magus had accomplished. And of course, they recognized, because of his might, which was not abstractly understood, but veritably incarnated by his person and the armies that he commanded as a medium of Zeus, submitted. The Macedonian king invaded, as you know, northwest India in 326 during his India was his great dream, right? This was the ultimate goal. Even if this campaign failed to conquer the Indo-Gangetic plain as a whole, as you know, Alexander had to fix Arabia, Carthage, but then his great plan would have been India, just like this was the case for Augustus. It made a lot of sense in a political and strategical sense. If anything, we will talk about this as well. The second type of war is termed conquest for greed, and it is more sort of aligned with broader human temper. It seeks plunder and the annexation of portions of the defeated territory. So it's already a mental, say a spiritual approach that, of course, betrays some materialistic interest driving away from spirituality. Finally, there is a third, known as demonic conquest, targets the complete political eradication of the enemy state and its absorption, or at least its basically annihilation to the conqueror's realm. This is also a deeply traditional concept stemming from probably in the European background. You look at this Hindu vision that deeply resonates with the fact that, again, if your points need violence to be imposed, they are at least sinful to the extent they don't convince your opponent. Naturally, in the human and fallen world, violence is normal, and so we appreciate sort of better and lesser grades of it. But simple destruction, even though deserved in providential sense, is not is a product of a fallen dimension. It's not, in fact, an absolute divine achievement. All right, you can have incredibly feeble polities, and one manages to destroy one another. It doesn't mean that we are so strong as a polity that is simply recognized by these ones as a legitimate ruler, and therefore simply uniting in a traditionally corporative sense to be stronger together. Again, incredibly important concept. We will talk more and better about the Pax Romana regarding this perspective, also in Roman metaphysics and Catholic legacy. Though generally frowned upon in Indian philosophy, the Arthashastra endorses this approach. The rulers of Magadha, that was a powerful ancient Indian kingdom in present-day Bihar, known for its role in the rise of major empires, frequently engage in this so-called demonic conquest, incorporating several neighboring states. Obviously here, again, we're not judging by contemporary standards that are also completely distant from the actual, appreciation of these philosophies. But it's obvious that this religious idea could be sort of fuel for very specific political and therefore also close-of military action. Though, in fact, generally frowned upon in Indian philosophy, the Arthashastra endorses this approach to the extent that we explained is at least deserved by those who suffered this fate. The Mauryas, the dynasty that ruled, in fact, the homonymous empire between 321 and 885 BC, founded by the aforementioned Chandragupta Maurya, which unified most of the Indian subcontinent, especially in the north, again, in the Gangetic plain, built their empire, you can argue, to also different historical observers, primarily through this demonic conquest, although some peripheral regions may have been subject only to tributary obligations, right? The idea of annihilating vast parts, if anything, because of this perennial issue of political instability in India, brought, and also to the large amounts of manpower and labor force, brought to vast exterminations. Again, the same Chandragupta, regardless of the Buddhist propaganda, was one of the most ruthlessly authoritarian, violent, and bloody conquerors of his era. Otherwise, he could have not properly founded the Mauryan Empire to begin with. Of course, there was always a logic in it. We also have to understand how cunningly effective this was. We don't have just to follow the doctrinal body, also because history can't be fully reconstructed in every single instance. We unfortunately lack all the political details of Chandragupta's reign. Let's just say that, again, governing India was particularly complicated, and the extent of, tribute is also the one that can, the limit of this imperial reach. Due to the prominence of the so-called righteous conquest, which center on prestige and tribute in the best intentions or ideals of the rulers, warfare was primarily the domain of kings and professional warriors, according to the traditional case doctrine, leaving the common populace, in theory, largely unaffected, but in practice also directly contributing to the same. As we said before, there was historically a degree of pacification, of disarmament of the local population in India, simply because you don't need to arm masses of slaves working in your latifundia if you don't fear an actual reprisal of sort. Rulers, as always, single monarchs tended to associate with the third estate of the city-states and their militias that were, let's say, also, if anything, providing most of the logistical support to the actual feudal army of the same emperor, because the way these more power-concentrated states worked at the end of the day was with very homogeneous types of armies. The Kshatriya caste and their retinues were incredibly powerful, but in this sense they tended to functionalize an elite military efficiency with lots of people just working for this mounted retinues and only occasionally providing, in times of emergency, with actual armed peasantry. That was, however, always a resort, right? So the ideal, at least in the Indian literature of the era, is that civilians, that was also not really a category that really was conceptualized in this sense, because we're very far from citizenry and the civitas of the Romans, from which the term stems, but would have to remain undisturbed, with farmers continuing to till their fields even in view of opposing armies. This also did happen in different times in history, but it's not like in the sense farmers would remain unscathed from that, quite the contrary, also because Indian armies at some point were massive, numerically speaking, logistically crashing, and without these peasants' work, there was no way to make that enormous effort. Warfare adhered to a restrained, honorable code that ideally disapproved of deceptive tactics or ambushes. We know, of course, these things existed all the time. Just in strategic terms, of course, if you are the more powerful ruler, you're able to subjugate most of the land that matters, the fertile plains. And at that point, you will be forced, thus, to confront your enemy in open field if, of course, an enemy that largely, in fact, has those same resources that you want, is able to field something tendentially symmetric with yours, right? So there is always this dramatic back and forth in terms of subjugation, because it's not like every piece of land, namely under, say, Chandragupta, was garrisoned by his own troops. There wasn't probably that level of centralization of bureaucracy of statal administration, regardless of the terrific palace power, guard units, and so on. Everything worked, as we've seen in the Army's organization video, on some importantly traditional level of recruitment through the castes and through different key lords that were entrusted with, in fact, the centralized control of the various provinces. The Arthashastra declares, quote, "Open warfare, however, in which the place and time for fighting are indicated, is most righteous." Though adherence to this ideal was naturally inconsistent, at least outside of the logics of war. The use of poisoned weapons was condemned, and non-combatants, wounded soldiers, or those who had surrendered, were to be spared. Naturally, this literature, just like, the medieval chivalric one, it's not just it was written by the elite that naturally did not see favorably, combined armed tactics by, heavy spearmen plus longbowmen that were still, however, fighting, not in a class struggle, but under some other lord. It's just some broader style, say, continuing some specific poetic artistic standards, and the same leaders that were sort of commissioning these works were the ones who would use any kind of ruse also pretty well, and say, yes, understanding that there was something dark about not facing your opponent face to face, but still they accepted that fate, at least as much as they could also make it or fall to it in the same ways. Again, we wish we had much less stylistic, everyday sort of eyewitness descriptions of real battles as opposed to something more metaphysical and religious, but still, in practice, this is the same warfare that is taking place, and the fact that we have even a mention to say don't do this, we know automatically it's because this stuff was being done, and again by the top, not by some scoundrel whatsoever. Of course, the idea is that if you ambush, if you are say making this guerrilla, this hard form of war, it's because you are in the fringes, you're inferior, you can't still face the enemy face to face because you're not powerful enough. And so even though they could inflict losses through these tactics, they were also considered inferior. And this is something pretty much that we find in the West, right? Everybody carried them out, but it depended also by the degree of, let's say, of strategic resourcefulness that they had. And again, resorting to this is actually not the winning card. It's more often the declaration that you don't have any better capacity to literally have your army march into the enemy lands unopposed because your force is crashing, as it also happened, by the way. Now, in principle, chariot drivers and their horses were considered inviolable, but there was a level of sacredness attributed to properly the elite castes. As you know, in India, it was actually priesthood that owned that first estate, but the Kshatriya, of course, were endowed with a pretty prepotent level of sacredness. And this is a bit like, I don't know, the Pope prohibiting crossbow use in the 12th century. It's not like they were actually prohibiting crossbow use. They were saying at the time there were lots of heretics, there were lots of sects coming out of control of the, say, the central authority. And so if, say, you were a crusader using crossbow killing Muslims, it was fine. But if you use these weapons to attack and also to wound knights, the people who were meant to be at the top, it was considered something really infamous, also because there wasn't really another alternative. Eventually, the establishment triumphed also over the heretics, over these tactics, and integrated the latter, redeemed the former, also in part, other than just exterminating them, as we explained before, in their ever more integrated and functional armies. The deployment of armed chariot drivers indicates that, by the way, the chariot drivers, it's what in theory were the heroes individually, did need some specific protection. Also, here this verboten seems mostly to address like some sort of, like if you're not a charioteer, you can't target another charioteer. It's like, I don't know, in medieval times, you don't kill another guy's destrier, but mostly you don't need to kill him necessarily if you can. The idea is that you have to convince him that you are superior. But of course, these men would clash against one another, would kill one another. So we have seen a lot of chariot warfare also from the previous years, and we know that the crew was completely normal, and it was not just some sort of protection for the, not even the charioteer was the guy, the leader there. He would have more sort of combat focus than the driver. But it corresponded to a very specific and advanced functionalization and specialization of the various roles in combined arms tactics, also with the other arms, targeting each other, in fact. So likewise, ideally still, warriors were expected to engage only opponents of equal standing. Chariot riders against chariot riders, as we just said, infantry against infantry, and so on. This is actually truer than it seems, right? I published most of my my work revolves around the study of very symmetric battles, by the obvious consideration that most of these were fought historically everywhere, mostly by people who were of the same status, from the same country, next door neighbors, you can say, and therefore use the same literal armies. So if you have, here we don't know specifically whether infantry, for example, was always on the flanks or in the mounted troops in the center, but that was more functional way of fighting. These were symmetric arrays as much as they were symmetric with one another. Meaning also that, differently, for example, from the Macedons that loaded the right, these armies were more or less like even, a bit like the Roman ones. The Greeks were a bit the exceptions normally, right? But for different reasons that we don't have to repeat now, because I made lots of videos about Hellenistic, Macedonian warfare also. This was in part one of the few legacies that from the classical Hellenic period among probably the Hellenistic Macedonian style phalanx. Anyhow, it's obvious that if you have the strongest force in the center of the mounted troops, you will face normally something symmetric, just as much as, infantry wings will face other infantry wings. However, it's obvious that everything revolves around combined arm tactics. It's not like that you just deploy these troops separately for the sake of efficiency, but no other sort of combination in the battle line. The wings can close on the flanks of cavalry, etc. So again, everybody accepted the fact that it could be killed by somebody of higher or lower rank, right? And it's obvious that especially the elite would make a gigantic effort to fight against the other elite. It would not necessarily pursue the enemy. They would unleash, lower elements. But of course, noblemen killed a lot of lower people in many ways. And this is obviously always the reality of warfare, just by this qualitative stratification. In fact, this impractical restriction was also disregarded, even by the heroic figures of epic poetry, by the way, such as in the Mahabharata, the major Sanskrit epic narrating the Kurukshetra war, and containing extensive descriptions of warfare, notoriously. Certainly, in actual combat, we see things that, again, the epos had always been aware of, also as an accurate depiction of same warfare. Thus, what we understand from this attempt at regulating the same violence is the product of a already post-traditional world that was trying to maintain a specific social order rather than simply enforcing it in a higher spiritual sense. Armies gathered for war in large fortified encampments known as skandavara, a term for a fortified military camp in ancient Indian texts, possibly used as a base for standing armies as well, such as garrisons, because that's where it normally starts. In fact, it likely served to host this occupation forces were at least some standing, to some standing degree during peacetime. Right? And that's obviously how a state would normally operate. It could be also relatively, colonizing enterprises, meaning that they would send some communities of warriors, warbanders, to occupy some land, for example, in exchange for in fact, garrison duties, and without obliging them to serve in the army. But this was done by the Romans as well. The Roman colonies were specifically located in strategically relevant areas that initially were close to the enemy, and therefore, just by the same Roman presence there, allowed the local citizens not to be levied in the legions, because it's as if they had always already been serving in a military function by living there. All right. And what is interesting, of course, about naturally the literature we're reading now is also normally posterior. It was at least very old in the way it had been handed over across the millennia. However, it was written down only later, and that's the sort of the moment at which you can pinpoint that in time. And some of this stuff, like for example the Mahabharata, that we can philologically trace as probably as a written work, already again existing from millennia, is dated normally also with some important ambiguity, more than half of a millennium between the 3rd century BC, so we are basically here, but also the 3rd century AD. All right. These camps were meticulously fortified with ditches, ramparts, palisades, and towers, including an inner enclosure for the king and headquarters, which suggests, in fact, a more strategical use of these camps in a broader imperial universal perspective, so across regions, and therefore also aiming at hosting a sovereign in what would eventually evolve as a sort of settlement. The king, the emperor, would be safeguarded by palace guards on this occasion. Think about the Ottomans that created also their literal battle field fortifications that had the specific position of the Sultan and a particular deployment of the typical, at least, array, more or less replicated in any battle. Here, we are finding something similar. The Indians have really this obsession for cyclicity, numerology. There is a plethora of different palace guards throughout this period in general, also later Indian history, underscoring a great military complexity, but also political instability, because naturally these forces would have had some kind of regimental meaning that eventually would have been supplanted by maybe, I don't know, the forces of another ruler, or pretendant, or clan. And it's interesting to observe, in any case, a level of permanence. So the fact that at least for a few generations, as we've seen with the Hellenistic Katowikia, for example, there would be military communities locally that pass down their craft, so to say, generation after generation. The army advanced slowly toward the enemy, mostly because of the bigger size of the armies that are described in his sources, encumbered by a large entourage of non-combatants and the practice of transporting supplies rather than foraging. In this, the elephants that also traumatically and crushingly contributed to the logistical strains of the army were used. And so as a dual for like a bit of a combat one and a supply carrying one. Strategic forts were seized to protect the line of retreat as well, if you manage to dot the territory. This is also what like other armies did with these camps that were built at every stop, so to say. You could simply fall back on them. The trail we've studied in the Feudal how a withdrawal happens, operationally speaking. And so it's a way to also cover your retreat by different levels of fortified lines. Except, of course, if a big army is on your tail, this will be, in any case, overrun in the moment in which you abandon them. At night, a simpler camp, less elaborate than the Skandavara, was established. So we're not talking like the Romans, that ideally built literally a new camp every night, right? All the time they stopped. Which was a healthy training practice as well. The Indians, of course, also had smaller camps that also in friendly territory and or in situations that did not require any particular, let's say, alert of possible offense were established. Temporary ones, right? Before their clash with Alexander, the Katayoi, a tribal group or confederation in northwest India, so a bit more of a tribal area as opposed to a statal one like what was being attempted by the Maoris in the Indo-Gangetic plain. Katayoi possibly related, by the way, to the Kshatriya warrior class in a sense of, again, an hegemonic people over some surrounding population, right, that they lorded over, or at least a specific regional people having amassed a substantial force from nearby tribes, and again, traditionally segmented in the various social cases, fortified their position within a wagon-laager, a defensive formation of wagons arranged in a circle, commonly used by nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. Bear in mind, of course, that northwest India had been historically the gateway to the Indo-Gangetic plain from Central Asia. And so all the nomadic groups that, starting from the Indo-Europeans, the Vedas had conquered the Indian subcontinent, that, as we've seen also in videos about the Indo-Scythians, will keep doing so. We also discussed a lot the meaning of, the Wagenburg, so to say. It's by far not an innovative or groundbreaking or genial or extraordinary tactical mean, right? It's just a very obvious, option to exploit, especially when you are in strategic inferiority. As a matter of fact, we talked extensively about this regarding the Hussites, that for some reason, probably because they were proto-Protestants, were overly hyped in Anglo-Saxon historiography. for tactical successes that, of course, in the relative context were quite impressive, but that in absolute terms were something really modest compared to how, say, Western European armies, for example, operated. In any case, it's interesting to get the information from the Katajoi because it speaks of the, say, different military mindset, culture, and profile of the more frontier fringe areas of India. These were largely also autonomous populations. Priests and astrologers bolstered the troops' morale before battle. This is exactly what happened in the Middle Ages as well, and we should recover a little bit this the concept of how continuous it was from antiquity, right? Including the sort of duels in front of the battle lines, tied with the manifestation of supernatural phenomena. Think about the Battle of Sentinum, the story of the hare, the story of the wolf. Obviously, there was a sort of wolf warrior from the Roman side, probably clashed with an enemy champion who fled, right? So, and then the story gets a bit adulterated by the centuries and secularization and modernization. Post-battle, in line with the limited scope of most clashes, aggressive pursuit was actively discouraged. It's a bit like what we did, the adage that we hear for classical Hellenic warfare. The truth is that, especially in India, this was not true. There was a lot of mounted warfare, a lot of pursuits, massive ones, as a matter of fact. But the notion is that this was a big tournament, right? And so, according to the rules of war, already the fact that you were turning your back and fleeing was the proof that you were a coward and your political reputation is integrated. In reality, what really happened is that you had been soundly defeated in open field. You needed to retreat as your army collapsed. And so, to an extent, of course, people could flee, but they could also be pursued. And so the ideal was just accepting your fate at that point, throwing yourself on the sword rather than fleeing. Hence, what these texts are actually suggesting. For example, the Arthashastra cautions, quote, "The vehemence of one returning again to the fight and despairing of his life becomes irresistible." Right? This is the idea within the various literal tournaments, the fact that lines clashed multiple times before finally collapsing on one side or another. Was the entire essence of the warrior. That's also how animals fight. I mean, if you play with your cat, it will be this moment of fight, and then he will run back and will start to point himself, fixing you again, and attack again after having recovered forces. So this is basically how also armies at large fight, and especially in a context that we have to consider as knightly, as often. More often than not, at least, smaller in scale as an affair, right? For ancient history, we have this prejudice of colossal battles that would have been basically the entire military history of it. And there is a reason why we think that, is to say, differently from medieval chroniclers and the fact that we know actually much more about the Middle Ages than ancient warfare. Also in antiquity, there were many smaller engagements that the historiographers, however, did not care most of the times to actually discuss. If you read more advanced sort of, for example, Polybius is very detailed. The same Livy often talks about smaller clashes. The Romans were less interested in numbers compared to the Greeks, but you understand by scale, of course, that a lot of other sort of war of sieges, so smaller clashes, etc., was pretty much out there. Another myth, by the way, is that in the sense sieges are so often and open clashes not really, right? What people skip because no historian normally has the patience of studying this. It's plenty of open field engagements. Obviously smaller in size, but not even that small that you can simply say, well, this is actually just simply a irrelevant clash, right? There are some medieval battles that just because it's the only thing that we know about a certain region that eventually cared about its own history become, look at this battle. Maybe it's just, I don't know, hundreds versus hundreds, right? But this was pretty much the norm in any other country, except for this sort of political, historical, and cultural bias. People do not really care too much. And it's as if you had probably the entire pulp of war, most of, say, the military pulp, taken away from history, and in generating this sort of weird mechanistic, structuralistic, very often deterministic and relativistic interpretation. Now, in combat, porous arrangement at the Daspas, remember that Porus is the Indian ruler who fought Alexander the Magus in the battle that we just mentioned in 326, near the Daspas River, modern Jhelum River in Pakistan, likely exemplifies this typical deployment. The elephants. The Indians had plenty of them. As you know, they sent them also in the east. Pyrrhus took them to Italy. I made a video about him, by the way, last year. And these pachyderms were positioned at intervals in front of the center, with infantry placed behind them, occupying the spaces between the animals and extending along both flanks. On each wing, cavalry were stationed behind a protective screen of chariots. So this is interesting for a number of reasons, because you would say, well, so cavalry here stays on the wings, not in the center. Here they're actually, first of all, in this seemingly along the same battle line. This is, by the way, just an ideal array. But it makes sense, of course, for the elephants to be in the front and to have also infantry interspersed among them, because, as you know, there was always an outflanking risk from the side of actual infantrymen, because the backside of the elephants was the only way to take them out. And so the elephants themselves, aside from the crews on top of them, always they were also pretty, combative and sort of elite in character. And this foot crew that followed them to avoid this kind of encirclement. But the elephant, in this sense, was more smashing than other mounted troops, and was, in this case, located in the center. It's also normal for chariots to be followed by cavalry. This, historically, is what we have seen essentially happening in the transformation from Bronze Age, sort of chariot-dominated warfare, to cavalry warfare. Between the end of the Bronze and the beginning of the Iron Age, where, of course, runners, eventually fully fledged cavalry, supported chariots and ended up supplanting them, right? Which for India is something that will happen centuries after Christ, right? It's a land that maintains this high degree, again, of chariot warfare connected with ultra elite one, right? The elite, the noblemen, were so powerful. They had control of so many people, and that they could really sublimate their own elite warfare by still fighting with chariots. They also had their own evolution, became ever heavier, at some point obsolete, especially considering the cavalry developments, more or less towards the migration era. We don't know. We would like to pinpoint more accurately, more precisely what happened. We know much better what happened in the Mediterranean, in Europe, in China, in other lands, but India is a bit more complicated. The Arthashastra outlines several alternative formations, by the way, some excluding infantry entirely, interestingly enough. Again, you have that video about Mauryan infantry, and we'll talk more about this in our video about the heavily armored infantry that also existed in minority but not negligible numbers. And so the idea is that the mounted warriors is the hero of the situation, is elevated by his status, by divine blessing, and so he can and will wield that power. And the few evidence, iconographically speaking, I inserted some of the pictures here too about Indian cavalry, suggests some pretty, again, developed, advanced horsemanship, probably in a heavy shock effect. In the Middle Ages, in the modern age, there is a Arab, Turkic, Mongolian influenced mostly from the steppes and feudal cultures that will actually be the winning one for different reasons, but that sort of tended to underscore the actual heaviness of native Indian cavalry and its important development. The mixed array position, the so-called mixed array, this one listed in the Arthashastra, position chariots in the center, flanked by cavalry, with elephants on the wings, rendering the elephants more vulnerable to outflanking. But you understand here there is the concept we were expressing a bit at the beginning, the heavier chariot smashing capacity in the center. Yes, the elephants as some sort of, you see, you can't quite maneuver the elephants so well. The only way to maneuver the elephant is to put a female in heat in front of the row of males and then having them go ahead, right? There aren't complex maneuvers. They're already complicated with chariots. You can imagine with elephants. Mostly cavalry is a more flexible one. But you see cavalry, for example, is on the wings of chariots. And that's a fascinating aspect as well, this arms interaction. Then you have the array so-called breaking with the center, placing elephants in the center, chariots on their flanks, and cavalry on the wings. This does not quite well explain whether this was a single battle line. What do we mean here by wings? Because, if the chariots are on the flanks of the elephants, where do the wings begin? This is not much of a problem. These are, however, seemingly all too much theoretical sort of digressions of some contemplative mind of the priesthood, perhaps, that was also not necessarily that involved in the practice of the art of war of the time. We find the Greeks toying, as you know, with ideal geometric patterns. I mean, it's part of some cultures' deal to express oneself this way. If anything, battle accounts should provide us with some sort of more sound evidence of what things work like, and these are scarcer, in fact. Another configuration featured chariots at the forefront of the center, infantry on their flanks, cavalry on the wings, and elephants in the rear. This is also fascinating. Chariots and cavalry did not necessarily always agree. If you look at the Battle of Magnesia of the same era, as you know, on the Aegean, you have the Pergamene allies of the Romans peppering with horse skirmishers the Seleucid chariots that were quite, terrible to find yourself in front of you. But these basically start running amok and they overrun their own cavalry. So possibly the idea of having infantry containing the same chariots and leaving the equestrians on the outer. In the outer position could be the logic of this specific array. Elephants in the rear, some sort of reserve for some sort of more closely hard-fought clash with, the infantry being here like the stopping part, and when melee ends up using sort of the elephants in more or less a precise way. Because again, the only thing precise about elephant warfare is, again, where the row hits and starts advancing and smashing and trampling everything on their path, right? Not more complex maneuvers. See Zama, all the instances where eventually elephants turned out even to be a problem rather than an advantage. The fact that the Indians used those a lot, however, is not just the fact that, there are lots of elephants in India. It's the fact that they were evidently useful to a degree, and by the sort of the practice that the Indians had learned, including riding them, even as a solo rider at some point. And the elephant is that great big tectonic, but also wise symbol that even the Romans will use in their, again, Indian conquest dream in, say, iconography, representation, chariots pulled by elephants. It's similarly the chariot of victory, right, of which also the Mahabharata, the Vedas are all deeply soaked in. So in Hinduism, it's all over the place. Because they were really more important still. socially. What the Vedas had impressed in this culture was historically very long-lasting in a spiritual and social sense. Now, typically, deformations we just described neglect reserves, as we've seen, not always, especially in the last case, though they are briefly mentioned. This is interesting, and I will not comment further on it, but it could reveal some sort of command control issue of these armies. All right, that's the first thing that comes into my mind. So mirroring the eternal political instability of this giant subcontinent that you could try to tame, but would always have these various issues popping up everywhere, even after you have just tamed them. But surely there were multiple lines of battle or arrays as well, just we don't see too much of that in general. Armies could be organized into multiple divisions, arranged in a line known as the staff, a column known as the snake, or a circle, intended to envelope an advancing foe. So these are also ideal formations. It's not like they would have not used, line and column are always used, but let's say, in fact, they are so generic that this list sounds akin to a divertissement. We also don't know exactly what the circle was, by the way, because it's not like you really go to battle with circles, and also some sort of more sort of wedge formations that seemingly are not really that useful in actual practice. If anything, we will discuss in other videos about armies that listed them among theirs, why. Alternatively, troops could be deployed to protect the flanks or center. Elite units were generally placed in the center, as we've seen, but could be repositioned to exploit enemy vulnerabilities or concentrate against their strengths. This was not really normally done, but it was possible. A specific section of the battle line to move diagonally across the field in case of need. Things could become really messy, especially if these were truly not particularly deep but wide formations, which also explains why they would have to advance slowly. Still, however, revealing some degree of also their general cohesion, or at least of individual training, more than disagreement between one another. It's easier to go all into battle with the guy in front of you rather than having to depend on the political treachery of guys that have to intervene in a depth formation. Why does that line remain still while the other requires its support? It's similar. Why does the last retreat? And it happens many times in military history, especially in feudal contexts like this one. The Arthashastra details the spacing of different troop types as well, which we have to understand as also relatively vague. We don't even have precise, definitive figures for, say, the Macedons, or at least we have, but there are different sort of units of measure. It's obvious that arrays could be flexible, that every unit could find itself in a different circumstance to adopt different spacing and so on. So we know we have just two measures for the Romans. One is from Polybius, the other from Vegetius. You can imagine how vague our understanding of the Indian armies is. There are, however, some punctiform informations about this. Infantry, in fact, were placed on one sama, which is an ancient Indian unit of measurement roughly equivalent to 1 foot, that is to say 30 centimeters apart, which is actually pretty tight, essentially phalanx order, which may even derive from the meeting with Alexander's forces. Could be some of that case. It could be it. However, it's also naive to think, and sort of incompetent to think, that just the order per se was the game changer. Also because if you just reason by this geometric measures, you also know that the battlefield is not, at that point, should sort of deflate. I mean, if what you lose in width, you earn in depth. If you have a specific confines constrainment, and if you say increase the depth as opposed the width as opposed to the depth, what does the enemy do? Like, goes to battle with an array that allows for its outflanking. It's obvious that armies were all much more conventionally and symmetrically deployed than we think, and that these figures were important, and they surely corresponded to a specific tactical need and gamble at the end of the day, because you never fully know what would happen in combat. But there were many more important factors altogether that dwarf such details. And so the Sama measure of 30 centimeters is fascinating because, combined with the space occupied by each soldier, approximates the 2-cubit frontage of Hellenistic close-order formations, referring to the tightly packed phalanx used by this point the Macedons in their armies. So, hence the hypothesis that infantry formations may have been temporarily reformed to cope with this thick Macedonian array. Cavalry were spaced 3 samas apart. Again, we just get this minimal info from literature, and we don't know what this is. Not literally saying all armies fought like that. No, right? This is not properly the intention of the source. It's just an approximation of what would have been maybe average in some context, but armies, again, vary. There is no such thing like an army that is the same of another. Elephants and chariots were positioned 5 samas apart. And these are, again, very thick arrays, very close orders. Double or triple spacing was possible, but not standard. In any case, it would have still been a heavy infantry order. At the Daspes, porous elephants were spaced allegedly 100 feet, so 30 meters and a half apart. This because, as we've seen, they needed space for some degree of action and maneuver. At least when they stopped fighting, they needed to move around, and it was important not to cram them. And so we understand here that probably things were a bit more agile, say less constrained. The number of ranks or depth per rank is not specified instead, but both infantry and cavalry employed dense mass formations rather than shallow lines, especially if, as we've seen, the tendency of Indian armies was not to deploy on too many battle lines in depth, which may just be a suggestion. By the way, I'm sure they used that. Elephants served as the primary shock force, at least in interest of individual unit, the individual animal. That is definitely more smashing than even a chariot. And consider that very heavy cavalry would charge literally at pace, because it was so heavy that even at few kilometers per hour it would overrun, right? Pretty solid enemy formations. Imagine an elephant, right, designated to shatter the enemy's line. Their psychological impact was considerable, but also the physical one. I mean, the psychological one is always primary in warfare. You don't really break because you're physically hit. It's the psychological reaction, even in that case, that matters. Wounded people can behave in very different ways depending on the circumstance. Troops and horses unaccustomed to elephants were naturally more nervous in front of them. The Indians would be more habituated to this or more also organized to fight, as we've seen with elephants. And in fact, this arm was in theory less significant in internal Indian clashes, or at least it was met on equal footing, right? Elephants also function as rallying points, as tall as they were. For example, Porus cavalry twice fell back on their own elephants because they orderly represented the line of battle to an extent as towering figures. The Arthashastra describes the elephant's role, quote, marching in the van, securing victory single-handed, restoring broken ranks, breaking up unbroken ranks, causing terror, showing magnificence. These are the functions of elephants, which is a beautiful description uniquely of a war animal that was really admired in its might and the measure of what the various Indian warlords could tame and harness, because that's also what they were trained to do, and they fought from the top of the same elephant. In fact, a general on his elephant was a highly visible inspiration and rallying point for his army. At the same time, he was vulnerable to attack. There are some advantages fighting from elephant back than horseback, but a disadvantage is that you can't simply run away too easily, that you are tendentially more exposed, at least in certain circumstances. There were likely turrets at some point used here. This is a contentious thing. We'll see also for other elephant warfare content. The Indians were a bit more nonchalant. They, as we've seen also in medieval warfare in Southeast Asian armies, like generally speaking, elephants could be even overloaded with fighters. There were specific weapons to wound other elephants, striking them in the eye or something like that, from the top of the same elephant. So everything was very dynamic and dramatic at the same time, without mentioning that elephants can really kill pretty badly, even just willingly. Like horses kick, bite, etc. Like elephants were specifically trained to withstand the horrors of battle, the noise, the clash, the confusion, and the many wounds that they would receive, despite their thick skin that still ached, right? And so the elephant was not particularly happy. The Arthashastra thus advises, quote, one appearing as the king should be stationed at the head of the army. Right? Chariots were similarly employed to break the enemy line in a more dynamic way, admittedly, often in support of cavalry rather than against solid infantry formations, because actually infantry was really constituting the numerical bulk of the Indian armies. And so even if, as we have already partially seen, especially the larger it was, massively speaking, the least qualitative it was, the first ranks were properly trained. They had really, to say, their own in combat. So again, even if infantry was normally subordinated to mounted troops from both sides, it would have been fairly rare to see in a conventional clash, like, I don't know, Indian elephants, chariots, cavalry simply charging infantry on the other side, waiting for them, right? Unless they were pretty well attested on a uphill or something like that. But generally speaking, at that point, you could also exploit the advantage with mounted troops. You see, there isn't politically or socially the capacity of this infantry to be simply alone, aside, detached from some oligarchic guidance that can provide with mounted troops, right? It's a bit like in our Middle Ages, right? Everything makes sense. Infantry is important. It's all based on combined arms tactics. But these highly sort of ideal texts do not talk about infantry that much, right? Some of them are discussed as dismounted heroes, champions, etc. But the rank and file infantryman was not particularly publicized because it really belonged to an inferior estate. Many Indian chariots were large, heavy vehicles with sizable crews, as we described before, providing significant impetus and firepower, but also rendering them slow, clumsy, and prone to becoming stuck in muddy terrain. Naturally, the Indians knew how to use these chariots efficiently. Let's just say that between the 4th and the 2nd century BC, even though chariot warfare would continue for a long time, the fact that these chariots are big reinforces the notion that they had to smash against some more static defenses, namely infantry. And so that infantry also in India had historically toughened up, right, during the Iron Age, as it had happened in the Mediterranean, etc. And so these are not simply agile chariots for stunts or whatever. The heroes would be able to perform them, no doubt. The nobility trained all their life for this. They could do pretty amazing things. But aside from the fact that the collective action is more important, still there is a pretty heavy bias that is aimed at properly smashing infantry formations if these resist. But mostly other chariots, because, again, there is no functionality, basically, of any arm that is not designed to counter the same arm, right? As we said before, everything was more symmetrical than just the toughening up of infantry had rendered a bit tougher the same battlefield that, as we've seen here with cavalry, elephants, chariots, was already pretty tough on its own historically in India. The Arthashastra notes, quote, ground not causing jolting without fields underwater and enabling a turnaround is excellent for chariots, right? There are lots of plains like this in India, but they're not everywhere. Much of the chariot effect was psychological, quote, reuniting broken ranks, breaking up unbroken ranks, causing terror, showing magnificence and making a frightful din. These are the functions of chariots. So this is essentially like the elephants. And naturally there's something higher because the chariot is truly like the symbol of the sun, of sacred royalty. So the elephant is just an untamed force, or better tamed force of nature, subjugated by these northern rulers back in the Vedic myths. So the chariot is the one with which the hero ascends to heaven, etc. It's the higher refinement of Indian warfare, and it's loaded with, if anything, I will make a video about probably for a historical military unit. The Indian war chariot of this era is very interesting, very colorful, very noisy, right? They had bells attached to that, which were meant to probably capture the sound of the divine in the ether, right? And this force that was there but did not manifest in earthly terms. There is, again, this prejudice that Indian cavalry were generally considered subpar. Obviously, as long as chariots were around and there were elephants, say, horsemanship could not be simply unchallenged, right? But they were actually very dynamic and quite impacting as well for their shock force. However, they were inferior to the Macedonians. This is important. The Macedonians were more loaded, qualitatively speaking. They were a more elite pack. They had literally conquered the world. They came overloaded. As we said before, India did not have a very strong, cohesive political background. Hence, their armies were more sort of aggregational, so to say, put together as coalition forces and lacking more extensive amount of sort of collective training to the intensive way the Macedonians did. They were in fact outmaneuvered and outfought by the horsemen of Alexander, and generally speaking were considered, at least this is yet another bias, cocky, right? In the sense that they were the Kshatriya case, they had this, again, inferior ranks to charioteers, but still basically being the big deal, the making up the majority, at least of the mounted retinue of the various warlords, made them overly confident, right? Allegedly paying little attention to scouting, being sort of lazy in this sense and less cohesive. This is a level of let's say, lack of collective training, regardless of individual quality, that we see, for example, from the Roman side, when describing, for example, the Germanic cavalry. Think about the Strategicon during the migration era, discussing the so-called blonde-haired peoples. It's not like say they're bad horsemen at all. The Indians will have pretty darn good horsemen. But they were devoid of a more enforced, coercive discipline and training. So to be so disciplined, as we said before. So the simplicity also of their formation, the fact that they apparently didn't perform overly complicated maneuvers, at least as far as we can see them fighting with Alexander, which is sort of the high point of also the confrontation with the Westerners. The Indian cavalry's roles included seizing advantageous battle sites or key points, raiding and destroying enemy supplies, exploiting gaps in the enemy line, attacking flanks and rear, pursuing a defeated enemy, fending off pursuit after defeat, and rallying broken troops. So basically everything that cavalry normally does, so there is no reason why the Indian one should have not done it. Here we're not discussing that, we're discussing the degree by which they did so and the order, the general cohesion, etc. that would have increased their performance accordingly. All right. As far as infantry is concerned, as we've already seen in other videos, they were essentially a secondary arm, with the Arthashastra providing limited detail on their role. Quote, bearing arms in all places and seasons, and military activity are the functions of infantrymen. So it's just basically meant for all seasons. Literally, you find them everywhere. They could always be co-opted for military service. Surely there was some sort of rota system, and these Indian warlords would have not, of course, lacked the knowledge of how to properly use infantry. So even if they didn't want to arm their slave masses working, also providing this enormous supplies for the armies, for feeding the elephants and so on, there would be some of them. Also, there were also, of course, freemen that lived in a condition of relative poverty that, however, were to be coerced because of, again, somebody else has ruled always everywhere. And they were therefore involved in minor roles, as we've seen, garrisoning, but even just, as seen here, in large numbers in the battle lines. Let's stress that, of course, Indian warfare is sedentary. All right, they're heavily informed in their origins, in their mindset by the Vedas that were nomads, but they are fully settled down. There isn't an enormous steppe influence at this point. It would be injected again, but it will always be sort of subsumed by the broader chthonic, feminine, telluric, and Dionysian substratum of the subcontinent, which is in this sense darkly immense and dangerous and terrifying. Hence, infantry is important. They may not be individually overly performing, but they are many, and they don't seem to end ever, right? So the description here from a nobiliar text, in any case, is the one, okay, these guys, we know how we use them. And yes, they were effective. They were using combined arms. We essentially can see also in the Sanchez Stupa the spearmen with partly armored, right? I'm going to make a video soon about that. And with spears, with shields, backed, let's say, being in front of longbowmen, that in India were also something, right? A missile element, that sort of, again, negative, poisoning, terrible thing. Telling the truth, in India, the bow is also a bit like the sword. There are swords as well, even double-handed swords, interestingly enough. Wood still, let's say, the advanced metallurgy in India due to the insufflation in the fornaxes to get higher temperatures thanks to the monsoons that have this intense yet steady regime, so to say, for a great part of the year, allowed this. Here we're talking a bit more elite troops. But you can imagine, looking at the Indian landscape, how, in fact, there aren't always those flat, relatively dry plains where you can use the heavier troops with greater commodity, both for, sort of the light terrain and the width of the same. There are wooded, broken areas where infantry can be quite effective, both in attack and in defense. The same infantry, however, in its greater conventional role, especially we've seen how relatively thick their order ideally at least was, would have difficulties on such grounds, and they would prefer the open one themselves. This is true for every army. Again, if you have some infantry that can well operate in the jungle, it's because, again, they don't have the capacity to withstand the enemy onslaught in open ground. And so they're basically declaring as nasty as they can be in guerrilla and ambushes and whatever, as we explained before, to gain the upper hand where it matters, because of course the most important centers out there are in the open, just for resources, politically speaking, people, right, agricultural goods and so on. The Arthashastra describes ideal infantry terrain, so always ideals, because these texts are just trying to mirror divine perfection on earth. They're not interested in giving advice, by the way, to people that were so habituated to warfare that they didn't even need to tell you how they waged it on a regular basis. Quote, without thorns, not very uneven, with room for retreat. This is also excellent ground for infantry, so basically the same one for mounted troops. Their close formations and long unwieldy bows, swords and shields were poorly suited to woods and scrub, but some infantries, especially the ones from those tribal backgrounds of the French, were instead better. Right, the south was wild and brutal. Was really like the epitome of this: less infrastructure, less supplies, smaller armies, but again greater ambushes capabilities and so on. But nobody also needed really to get too far there. Many rulers would also wage campaigns across all these territories. If anything, we can make videos about this, because Indian warfare is interesting in this regard. There is this notion that infantry were primarily used in India as missile troops, with Nearchus, an Hellenic admiral under Alexander, who documented observations during the Indian campaigns, states, despite their powerful two-handed swords. So he states that they rarely engage into hand-to-hand combat in internal Indian wars. This may be, again, filtered through the lens of the nobility. And so what Nearchus would have also been told by commanders, naturally, compared to the Macedonian peasanthairoi that were here the heroes of the situation, and that, in fact, would have steamrolled the same Indian infantry. Not without difficulty, because, again, you don't have to think it just because you have a phalanx, you win, right? It's the quality of the infantry, not much the way you go about that we've seen also with the Romans, with others in this Hellenistic warfare confrontations with the Macedonian phalanx. And so the notion is that they're just ranged troops. Naturally, many of them were poor, not to allow but their bamboo bows. But even these were actually terrible weapons. Obviously used in combination with heavy infantry that we also see iconographically represented. Again, I already made a video about, say, average Indian infantry at this point, and we, even if it's from years ago, explained how, of course, probably Indian infantry is underrated, probably even more than cavalry, except cavalry was more important. The Arthashastra notes that armored infantry should be positioned in front of archers, likely referring to javelin men, though they were not always armored. The notion that these were javelin men is just scholarly repeated at a point, but aside from the fact that the average warrior in the Senatory War was also a javeliner, I mean, look at the Roman legionnaire, right? You have this guy who basically has a spear as a main weapon, side weapon, a helmet if he's lucky, heavier armor, again, a shield set, and basically another couple of spears/javelins that he has to throw. So obviously it would be all kind of infantry. And the notion that it could be some armored javeliner, so some elite, for example, youth of the ensign of the major nobiliary houses of India that needed to test themselves into this hit and run combat with some fine weapon, but still passing this as an initiations test can't be something. It's more likely, however, that there was some kind of heavier Indian infantry that was actually pretty tough, pretty good at what it did. The two-handed swords were likely more of a chopping sort of falchion type, not much of an Iranian straight sword type. Also because, as we've seen, we'll see better, there was really a few armor around. Armor was really scarce in all of this. The elite would have been very well armored, there is no doubt about this, but in general, the notion probably of armoredness, in a broader sense, was pretty much beyond the overwhelming majority of Indian fighters for different reasons. As we explained before, you can have really massive agricultural output, but also civilizationally speaking, say compared to China or Europe, this doesn't mean anything, right? You can't have that, but how many people live there and what do they do with that wealth? That's what actually matters, all right? That's also why materialism is BS for that matter. But there is indeed therefore a necessity to chop a lot, or at least the possibility of chopping a lot without destroying other armor, because normally those who have to destroy other armor are the same armored forces. They can't come closer to armor to properly rip it apart or damage it beyond repair, which may actually occur by destroying your own weapon for that matter. We don't see too much of this in India. We are sure that it was something that some probably, knightly force was surely very Iranian influenced, and this would continue throughout Indian history, but they wouldn't, say they would quickly adapt to local warfare that was sort of softer, lighter in terms probably of targets. There were surely heavy spearmen, swordsmen, very well armored as well. There would have been really few, mostly palace guards, similia, and for the rest, the Kshatriya preferred mounted combat. Some infantry were assigned to support chariots and elephants at close quarters, as we were recalling, guarding their flanks and preventing them from being hamstrung. Some infantry would, of course, be used as non-combating force, like some sort of pioneers, field aides, troops properly deputed to protect logistics, supplies, the camp, etc. So some roles would be very passive, encircling an enemy fortification. Siege warfare was really also a very important thing, and just for the necessity of having armored troops on foot, also like those were the stormtroopers. Elephants could smash through some fortifications for real. This would continue also into later warfare in down the eras. But the stormtroopers were the men-at-arms, right? So dismounted knights and so on. An early source allocates 2 infantry to each chariot and 8 to each elephant. Again, numerological ideal for some reason we can't better understand. The practice is, however, also mentioned in the Mahabharata, one of, in fact, most important military sources that we've seen in Sanskrit epics, alongside the Ramayana, rich in descriptions of ancient warfare as well. Despite the preference for open warfare as the most honorable approach that we described, the Arthashastra suggests various ruses as well, including extensive use of spies and bribery, which is more of a political thing, feigned retreats, diversionary attacks, often using forest tribesmen, allied troops, or deserters rather than one-own's men. So it's like, the lower elements can act in shadier ways. This is something you find also in medieval knighthood. A true noble knight would not, carry out a flank attack, at least by reputation. Servant knights that existed as well would do that, right? And so, again, morality was quite ambivalent and tilting alternatively to different directions. The same goes, in fact, for flank or rear attacks were seen as unmanly, unvirile, because it was not a face-to-face attack. But the fact that the Arthashastra did so much condemns these things, however, lists them and spends so much time describing them, it's quite interesting. luring the enemy to raid a cattle herd and then ambushing them. It's quite fascinating, attacking at night, or exhausting the enemy with feint attacks throughout the night before striking the next days. This was naturally some form of deception, and so it did not fit in the best intentions of a virtuous general. However, there were also quite practical means to sort of provoke an enemy, to cause some byproduct, like, I don't know, tiring him down, preventing him from sleeping, et simile. A general could attempt to scare the enemy's elephants and horses by stampeding herds of cattle, buffaloes, and camels laden with sacks of pebbles to create the terrifying noise. You see here also all the different type of animals in different climatic zones of India as well. I mean, the variety within the system was pretty big. If short on chariot horses, a king is advised to harness bullocks to some chariots, an indication of the typically low speed of Indian chariots with bullocks could serve as a comparable substitute, by the way. So again, big chariots that are mostly used for smashing in some more or less indiscriminate way against the enemy lines. Imagine the mass of this. That's what always, from a collective point of view, you must imagine, like the psychological shock of seeing like a host of a battle line of enemy chariots charging you. It must have been terrifying. And this is yet something that, as you know, the same Macedons, think about Gaugamela, but think about the Achaemenid army, like knew how to cope with, and we have to talk more about that context for that matter. The general outlook here, as you understand, is also pretty brutal. Imagine the elephants smashing into an enemy formation. The Arthashastra suggests forming the center with carts pulled by donkeys and camels. If you have to, for example, to withstand, for example, an elephant attack because you have a few of those yourself. While camels might unsettle enemy horses and the carts could presumably carry archers, their military value appears limited. In fact, some of these ruses were just, as we explained, the proof that you didn't have more conventional force to oppose to your enemies. Right? So we have all these kinds of of pictures, of flashes, and that we need to recompose in something more unitary. Right, and as we've seen, probably Indian armies were complex enough. Here we're also talking different centuries in which sort of different things may have happened, depending on the balance of the various estates, of the political situation. There's also external threats, such as Alexander's arriving to the Indus. So mechanisms that fundamentally suggest some similarity with other tactics, armies, etc., and that we will have to look, if anything, at more military historical units and specific battles to fully sort of appreciate. There is a degree of uncertainty because, unfortunately, even if we can act by analogy, this is literally the documentation that we get. So you can't really say, like in other contexts, okay, we can't fundamentally reconstruct what this or that battle array was in a serial fashion across this region for centuries. This is much like the few that the Westerners can document is pretty scanty. Like, there is not even a great interest in this kind of things. We can, however, imagine that in the sense there wasn't anything radically unconventional about Indian warfare. I mean, we see all this scattered information as potential. Oh my God, how is it? It complicates the picture. Not really, right? It's mostly something obvious in its straightforward use of different units, different battle lines. There is a need for outflanking and smashing. Like, more or less things work in the same way, of course. things sort of always work. There are some sort of unique traits. For example, the overwhelming amount of elephants. There is really, except from some parts of Southeast Asia, anything comparable to this. Not even in the Mediterranean, where there is elephant warfare, and even the Romans used that. There is this protracted use of chariot in combat, which are not some sort of obsolete force, but they're still relevant. There are, in this sense, also cavalrymen together, with them, and so there is all a set of circumstances where you can appreciate the complexity, but also the compaction of these forces. The rest is perhaps better understood from political history, from all the indicators we get from the attempts, for example, at establishing an actual statal power in India, that the relentless attempt to succeed in that, which would always sort of shipwreck to an extent. There is obviously also some social indication. We know of the diversification, city militias, the peasant levies, the nobiliar retinues, also foreign mercenaries, because, again, the system is big enough not to witness any radical impact, right, and significantly altering the essentials of the systems, as we've seen, is fairly characteristic on its own. Also as a result of external influences, but not necessarily in a deeply transformative sense compared to what the local dimension can offer, right? Again, unfortunately, the sources are what they are. And here, I don't even remember what I was talking about, but because you arrived today, I'm recording late, I'm forgetting things, but you understand the gist of it, right? We have to maintain some important comparison and stay open to the false friends, to the limits of our analysis, and the fact that there is probably a way to sort out more or less how this mechanism worked, but we will never have the exact certainty, all right? Very well, however, I'm glad to talk about Indian warfare. As I was saying at the beginning, we have plenty of content already made about this. I'm glad if we manage to create more about this. If we are far from completion, but for example, the Mughal era we introduced in a fairly comprehensive fashion. We talked about Mauryan warfare. We talked about all an important set of sort of Indian. We recently started out medieval Indian warfare, which was sort of the one we had left a bit behind. So I'm fundamentally satisfied. Probably we will be deepening our series with more historical unit episodes, because those, again, are also more stringent in a sense. They show us essentially what these troops were about, and so they can tell us essentially the consistency of the various arms of the various units that they form, their role on the battlefield, their cooperation with other troops. Just watch these videos because they are actually interesting. They're not random. They're not sort of just for the sake of encyclopedism that we pursue on Schwerpunkt, right? There is enough, and we're glad, naturally, to make it. My purpose, as you've seen, has remained practically unchanged since the beginning. We have done nothing but improving, however, at the same time, so we can have really lots of different videos now about all the most different topics, and we really hope that this content, this encyclopedia of warfare, is becoming useful for an ever larger amount of people. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.